I'm Jonathan, and I'm going to be presenting on getting agile with Tableau. First, I'll tell you a little bit about my employer and me. So I work for a company called Intuit. Intuit's mission is to improve our customers' financial lives. And you may have heard of or used some of our products, TurboTax, QuickBooks, and Quicken. There's a couple of random statistics up there, but the one that's really interesting is the one at the bottom, and that's what our TurboTax season looks like. And so this year, we filed 29 million tax returns from January 31st to April 18th. That's 12 weeks out of the 52-week year where we make all of our money. And so that's a very fast-paced time. It's a very competitive environment. You've got a lot of competitors introducing new services. We've got changes in tax laws. We've got government actions. And so a lot goes on. So we're constantly, during those 12 weeks, making improvements to the product and responding to changes. And myself, I'm on the TurboTax analytics team. So this is a central team that supports all of TurboTax, but I focus specifically on customer care. Now for us, customer care isn't just support. It's not just when you pick up the phone. We actually try to use data about our customers' questions to improve the product. So when somebody has an issue, we try and figure out why did they even have an issue and go back and fix that in the product. We also do focus on when they do need help, making sure that they get the best answer they possibly can as fast as possible. So just to give you an idea of the type of people I work with product managers on the TurboTax product, as well as customer care operating leaders on our support site, on our help search engine, on our content teams. Now, what I would like to tell you guys today is after you've unleashed Tableau in your organization, how can you keep the speed as you scale up? So I'll talk quickly about what was the first problem that we were solving as we brought in Tableau, but mostly I'll try and focus on what happened next. How did we handle the explosion in demand? So the first problem that we were trying to solve when we brought in Tableau was that we had a lot of static, high-level data points being shared in Excel and PowerPoint. Now, when I started out as an analyst, I could step away from my desk to go to a meeting, and when I came back, I could have 3 emails from a bunch of different people, all asking for clarifications, deep dives, roll-ups, before and after comparisons, because those static high-level data points weren't enough to really answer the question. So I was spending all of my time just fielding questions, not having time to do anything very interesting or think really hard about the problems that the business was having. So we brought in Tableau. One of the first dashboards that we built was this dashboard that let all of our internal partners look at all of the different reasons customers were contacting us with a whole bunch of different filters. So people could filter to different products. They could filter to different channels. They could filter for specific time periods, do comparisons year over year, before and after, get all sorts of metrics associated with those contacts. How long did it take us to handle them? So this ended up being one of the most widely used dashboards with over 80 distinct people using it. Now think about that, 80 people. I was having a hard time keeping up with questions from just 3 people. So if all 80 of those people had to send me an email or set up a meeting in order to get the answer to their question, they'd never get their job done. So we actually changed what the role of the analyst was at TurboTax. We changed from being question answers to coaches. We put the data in our customers' hands, and we allowed them to get their answers faster. Our general manager said recently that strong teams know how to keep score. And by putting the data in our partners' hands, every single one of our 500 employees was keeping score individually. It was no longer just a select few who got to declare what the score was. So when we went to meetings, we could have our partners actually bring up dashboards on Tableau server and try and answer questions themselves. And I could sit back and watch and say, yeah, I think you're using that data right. Or I might say, no, here's how I would actually think about it, and maybe point them in a different direction. Sounds easy, right? So after we brought in Tableau, I didn't really have anything left to do. I got to lounge by the beach all year. Well, obviously not. I've already kind of told you, given away the topic of my talk, but this is about what came next. So to kick that off, I'm going to give you a little metaphor. How many of you guys know this mouse? Anybody? All right, that's how I know who in the room is parents, or who actually just is young at heart. So for those of you who don't know, this mouse is the star of a little story that goes something like this. If you give a mouse a cookie, he's going to ask for a glass of milk. And then he's going to ask for a straw so he can drink the milk. And then he's going to ask for a mirror to check for the milk mustache. And then he's going to see his big whiskers and ask for some scissors to trim his whiskers. And then a broom to sweep up the whiskers. And then he's going to be so tired he's going to want to take a nap. So in this metaphor, Tableau was the cookie. Tableau helped us unlock the value of our data. And it created the demand for much more. After years of being piled under questions, we were starting to say, yeah, we have the time to help you think about this new business problem. We have the time to help you dive deeper into this. So we had a second great problem. How could we meet the demand as it scaled from a couple of dashboards to really running the business in Tableau? And how could we do that without burning the candle at both ends? Because those 80-hour weeks, you can only do those for so long. I'm going to share 4 key strategies for how we did that. The first is that we embedded analysts in the actual working teams. The second is that we combined layers of work that used to be separated. We adopted Agile, and we iterated often, really often. I'm going to go into each one of these. So what was the problem that we were trying to solve by embedding analysts? I mentioned earlier that I was on a central analytics team. And so that meant that I was actually in a different building from a lot of my partners. I was in building 2. Some of my partners were in building 3. Actually, a lot of them were in building 4, which is a good 15-minute walk away. So that meant that when they wanted stuff, they had to set up meetings. They had to get things on the calendar and on the priority list. And so I wasn't really feeling what the team was going through. I was in orbit. So what did we do about that? We got embedded in the teams. We did that by attending their staff meetings, their working sessions, their executive updates. We sat with the teams so that we didn't have to walk 15 minutes over to the other building. And we really narrowed the focus during that heavy 12-week tax season that I talked about. Because you can't be embedded on 5 different teams. That's not really being embedded. So we picked. Yeah?
When you say embedded in those teams, does that mean, were you all part of another team, you created virtual teams? Sort of?
Exactly, yeah. So an example is that there was a self-help team, and I took myself and made myself a part of that self-help team. I attended all their meetings. I sat with them.
You didn't report into that organization?
No, correct. Yeah. That whole organization was actually completely separate, rolling up under another vice president. But I said, you know what? This is my team. I'm going to sit with them and be a member of this team. Now, the benefits of that is that I really owned the objectives, and I steered the team towards them. Instead of just answering questions, I was able to say, well, I know what you're shooting for, so here's how I think you should look at the data. I also got to see how the decisions were actually made. I got to see which metrics they cared about for their decisions. And so I could shape how the data was being presented so that I knew that it would actually influence the decision. And because I was there for all of the steps. I was able to influence the strategy and not just the insights. I was able to influence the architecture of how the product was built and how the data was collected. And lastly, and this is one of my favorites, I was able to answer questions in real time. So it's great when you're sitting with the team and they have a question to say, hey, why don't you just bring up Tableau Server? I'll show you where you can get that answer. Sometimes it takes some coaching to get them to figure out how to use a report. And it's great to be able to sit right there with them and answer it in real time. Another thing that's good is that sometimes you get questions that you can't answer from a published report on Server. But if you're there, you can pull up Tableau Desktop, do something new, and then see if that answers the question. If it does, you can build that into your report that's published on Server. Now, the next problem that we had to solve. So I'm going to share a quote with you guys. And I'd like you to raise your hands if you've ever heard this quote. Why does it take so long to answer a simple question? It never really is a simple question. It seems like a simple question, but it takes a lot of work to answer it. But why does it take so long? Why is it a complex question? That's the problem. So I'm going to share with you what is the old way that we organized around the work, why is it so slow, and what are we doing differently now? So the traditional way that analytics is done in a big company is that you have some kind of a business person, say a product manager. They're going to come up with a business strategy, and this is the foundation of your tower of analytics. If you're lucky, they're also going to come up with key performance indicators and a learning plan. That's if you're lucky. Then that business person is going to reach out to some of the development people. They're going to come up with development requirements, which will also include how data is captured, how it's transformed, and if you're lucky, how it's put into a data warehouse. Now this data, it's not data like you or I would know. It's hard data. We can't let regular people touch it. So we let the technical analysts query the data, build a data source or a business objects universe, and then finally, the day before you need to make a really big decision about that business strategy, you let the business analysts touch it, and they get to build the visualization, get to the insights, make the recommendation. And all I can say is good luck to that business analyst. I hope that that tower was built well. Now, why is it so slow? I mean, there's obviously one reason is that there's a lot of handoff points here. So there's a lot of meetings every time it goes from one step to the next. There's another reason that it's really slow too, and I'm going to talk about that other reason. I'm going to use an example from early in my days as an analyst. We were working on understanding why customers were getting so confused at one particular part of the product. And we thought we almost had it. But before we really knew what was going on, my partner, the product manager, said, oh, we actually need to know if this is really affecting new users or returning users. That will tell us if we're on the right track, if we know why they're confused. Now, I don't have new users or returning users in my data because I don't actually have the data. So I have to go talk to my partner and say, hey, can you add customer type to the data source? Now, let's say that that customer type doesn't even exist in the database. He has to go to the engineer, and the engineer can try and add it to be collected from the application. Now, this has all been fine so far. But what if the engineer doesn't actually understand what we're trying to do with the data? And so what he adds is a different type of customer information. And so what I get back isn't something that's going to answer the question at all. Well, that whole process where my partner has been pinging me every couple of days saying, hey, do we have that slice yet? Do we have that slice yet? I've been saying, okay, it's almost there, it's almost there. And then I get it, and it's not what we need. So here we need to go and kind of start all over again, or maybe call a fire drill, get everybody in a room, put all of their other work off while we solve this problem. Neither of those is really great. So is this process broken? I mean, you could say that, that I'm the broken part of the process. All I had to do was come up with perfectly unambiguous requirements that addressed every possible use case and edge case before I've even seen the data. Now, sometimes that works, but it's pretty optimistic to expect that to work all of the time. I think the problem with this process is that every single person in this chain here has to really understand what is the business problem that we're trying to solve. And so you either have to spend all of your time communicating about what that business problem is, or you spend all of your time fixing mistakes when people don't understand. So what can we do differently? Anybody? Oh, I guess that's me. Well, remember those embedded data analysts? We narrowed their focus so that they were really focusing on supporting just one team really well. But in addition to that, we expanded their scope. So this person was now responsible for delivering end-to-end across this tower of analytics. There's still other partners involved. The analyst isn't coming up with the business strategy. That's still the product manager. The analyst isn't implementing how we capture data. That's still the application developer. But you have one person who's responsible for driving from the very beginning to the very end to get to those insights. Now, one of the things that's really great about Tableau is that it gives you a seamless path from low fidelity to high fidelity. So even before you have all of these back-end things implemented, before the application is collecting data, you can start playing with how you're going to visualize it using just some fake data that you created in Excel, copy and paste that into Tableau. And so you have one person who's able to operate kind of at multiple levels here. Now, what happened to all those technical people in the middle? Did that one embedded analyst magically become so productive that put all those other departments out of a job? Not really. Those technical people were actually really critical for the success of this. What happened was they shifted their focus. They shifted their focus from performing those individual pieces of work on the business requests to building the scaffolding that let one person execute end-to-end. An example of what they did there was we used to have an engineering team that was responsible for all of the change requests for web traffic collection. Anytime somebody wanted to make a change in how we were tracking how people were hitting pages on our website, we had to go to that one team of engineers, and they had to do it. And as you can imagine, those engineers were pretty busy because we've got a lot of web pages and a lot of different pieces on our website. So they changed their focus. Instead of processing all of those individual business requests, they began to focus on building a software development kit that would let all of the different teams across TurboTax collect data on the web really easily. Now, I say scaffolding very deliberately. I almost used the word platform. That's actually, the team here is actually called the analytics platform team. But I don't think it's really a platform because that implies that they're only involved at the beginning stages of the process, and then it's a handoff. But they're actually still involved at all stages. They're responsible for providing those software development kits. They're responsible for making sure that the database is easy to connect to get data into. They're responsible for making sure that Tableau is up and running. So they're actually still partners every step of the way. They're just no longer executing on the individual business requests. Now, a really good question that I got from some people when I was practicing this presentation was, so how do you find those embedded analysts? Because all of these things, all of these activities that you're asking them to do are really different. And it's hard to find somebody who's going to be really good at every single one of them. And that's true. It's hard to find somebody who can do everything here at an expert level. So you've got to pick and choose what's going to be really important. Now, the most important thing here is making sure that you have somebody who can think critically about the business, who can think about what is the business problem and come up with ideas for how to use data to solve that business problem. Number two is you want somebody who can ask questions when they hit something that they don't understand, because they're going to encounter problems that they don't know how to solve. And so you want to make sure that when they do, they're not just going to fake it, but they're going to recognize that and reach out for help. The last thing that you absolutely have to make sure they have is some kind of skill in manipulating data. Now that takes many forms. Using Tableau is a form of manipulating data. Writing SQL queries is another good example. Using Excel even. But you've got to make sure that they know something about data. And then over time, they're going to get better at all of the different pieces of this. But that's what you want to make sure they come in with at the beginning. And if you're lucky enough to have a team, not everybody has to be an expert in everything. Because remember, you want people who are good at asking questions. And so if you have one person who over time becomes a Tableau Zen master, and you have another person who becomes a SQL guru, you have another person who becomes really good at understanding relational databases, then the team as a whole is an expert in everything, even if every individual isn't. All right. So now I'm going to talk about Agile. because that's in the title of my talk, so I had to cover it somewhere. So before I go into the problem statement, I'm going to give you a little bit of background on what Agile is, just so you don't get lost when I start using words like sprint. So what is Agile? Agile comes from software development. It's a set of principles about how to work that delivers business value in the face of complex and changing requirements, which is pretty much the only requirements we seem to have these days. They have this thing called the Agile Manifesto. And in that manifesto, they say that they value individuals and interactions, so people and how they talk to each other, over processes and tools. They value working software over comprehensive documentation that just describes how the software is supposed to work. Customer collaboration over contract negotiation, and responding to change over following a plan. Now, Agile is just a set of principles. It's hard to run an operating mechanism just with a set of principles. But there's a lot of different programs that have come out of Agile, and one of them you may have heard of is Scrum. That's one of the most popular flavors. That's the version that we modeled ourselves after. Scrum is just a way of planning, communicating, and executing that centers around getting all of the business needs onto a list and then picking off a small list to focus on and commit to in the short term. Now, I'll get into why did we do this. So, like I said, we had a lot of requests, and they're not actually all created equally. There's a lot of junk out there. We needed a way to sort through all that junk so that we could find the diamonds. We needed a way to know that we were focusing on the most important stuff that was really going to make a difference. Another thing is that it's really easy to just plod along in a single direction. Because when you're working on a lot of different stuff, you've got a lot of things that are about 50% complete, 80% complete, and you really don't want to stop working on them because you know if you just work a little bit more, then you'll get to 100% and everything will be good. But the problem is when you have too much that's half done, it's hard to do that. And so it becomes very hard to change direction. So we needed a way to know that every time that we were picking off work and executing on it, that we were getting it to a done state. So that way, when new things come up, we could pivot and change direction very quickly. And new things came up all the time. We also needed a way to avoid waste. Now, why does stuff get wasted? It's wasted if you're working on the wrong stuff, or if you're doing it in a way that doesn't solve the problem. So I've certainly spent a lot of time thinking about really clever metrics, really interesting ways of looking at the data. And then when I showed that to somebody who would actually need to use that, I've heard, yeah, that actually doesn't tell me anything different than this other report you have out there. Or maybe it just wasn't the right time for the business. And so we needed a way to make sure that we were touching base with our partners frequently. That way we would know that if we were on the wrong track, at least we weren't on the wrong track for long. So we wanted to eliminate waste. Now, what did we do to get started? It was pretty easy for us. We started by learning Scrum. For us, we did that by sitting down with some software developers, and they actually taught us how Scrum worked, and they brainstormed with us how we could bring that to our team. If you don't have software developers laying around just waiting to help you, we're pretty lucky there. There's a lot out there if you Google it. I Googled Scrum beforehand just to see what popped up, and it's actually a lot of really high-quality stuff, because there's a lot of consulting companies that put that stuff out there hoping to sell you consulting services. So we learned Scrum, and one of the things we learned was user stories. I'm going to talk a little bit more about user stories because they're one of my favorite things in the world. But at the end of the day, it's really just a way of getting all of the ideas and wants out of your partner's heads and getting them down into a big list. And so we asked our partners to commit to giving us new work and user stories. We weren't strict about it. We didn't say, you can't talk to us if you don't have a user story, because we were actually sitting with them. And so we encouraged them to still come to us with the questions they had and have casual conversations. But before we embarked on a large project, we wanted to make sure that we had a user story for it. Now, the next thing we asked our partners to commit to was planning. We got them to spend 30 minutes a week with us, going through that big list of user stories and helping us pick off what was that short list that we were going to commit to delivering in the next week. Now, I would usually, beforehand, go through that big list myself and pick off what did I think was the most important. And that was good because it helped move things along more quickly. But I made sure that they had the last call on what was the top priority. And that's really, really important because when you're asking your partners to prioritize for you, they start thinking harder about what's really important to them. They start working harder to make sure that they're coming to you with the most important stuff because they don't want you to work on the stuff that's not important. It's easy for them to get lazy if you're prioritizing for them, but if you make them do it for you, they start to work harder. Now, the user stories and the planning process together are what helped us pick the diamonds out. That's what helped us make sure that we were focusing on the most important work. The planning process also was what helped us be nimble because we weren't picking off a big list of stuff to work on. We were picking off what's the small number of things that we're going to completely deliver this week. And at the end of the week, we know that we're done. And if something new comes up, we can move on to that new thing. The last thing we asked our partners to commit to was the review process. So 30 minutes a week to sit down with us, go through those stories, and ask if they were done or not. Now, a lot of the times, they weren't done. That could be for many reasons. So we would take that 30 minutes to figure out what happened. Was it a bad user story? Was it too vague? Was it too big? Was there a roadblock that came up in the execution that our technical team could help us by building a new piece of scaffolding? And that retrospective process helped us get better and better over time. Now, we included those, as well as all of the work we completed and what we were focused on next, in a sprint summary email. That summary email was actually a really nice touch that I thought was just a little thing, but I heard from my partners that they loved getting those summaries because that let them know what we were working on. I promised I'd go a little bit more into user stories. So, what's so good about user stories? There's a specific way of writing them that's super helpful. There's a template for it. And I'll give you an example of a user story that uses the template. As a TurboTax product manager, I need to be able to see which screens in TurboTax generate the most contacts so that I can prioritize work to improve those pages, but I can't because the names of those pages are incomprehensible code numbers. Now, that seems like a really exhaustive and detailed way to phrase it, but it's a lot better than saying, I can't make sense of this report. I don't know what's going on here. Just make it easy to use. It's also a lot better than saying, can you make a dimension table for screen ID? Now, what's good about it is it gives us a clear understanding of the business need. And it's also easy to prioritize. If we had a user story called create a dimension table for screen ID, nobody would know how to prioritize that. Whereas if we had a user story that says, help us prioritize what are the most important pages to work on in TurboTax, well, it's a heck of a lot easier to get some business leaders in a room and get them to comment on the priority of that. It also gives us context on what the current gaps are. Because it ended with, but I can't because that tells me what they've already tried and why what they tried isn't meeting their goals. There's some other things that go into good user stories. There's something called the INVEST criteria. I'm not going to go over what each one of these letters is, but I'll go over some of the good ones. So S, small or sometimes called sized appropriately, means it has to be small enough that you can actually get it done in your sprint, which for us was 1 week. That's a really high bar. But by saying that we have to get done in a week, that, like I said, is what helped us be really nimble and move on to new things quickly as they came up. It also narrows down the list of things that you can commit to, because when you're looking out just 1 week in advance, you get to think really detailed about, well, am I really going to be able to get that done in a week? Well, probably not because of X, Y, Z. And so you get to really quickly eliminate things or focus on things that are going to add more value. Now, V is the one that says valuable. That means it has to be a valuable deliverable. Now, why does it have to be valuable? What I mean by valuable is whatever the business is trying to accomplish, you have to be able to accomplish it at the end of that week. And the reason is that if you can't get any feedback on it. So let's say that the user story was create a dimension table for screen ID. Let's say I spend the week thinking really hard about what's the best data model for screen ID. What's going to be the most elegant when I bring it into my other data? And I come up with a really good dimension table. And then I sit down with the product manager at the end of the week and say, look, here's my dimension table. They're going to say, great, I don't understand what that is. Whereas if I phrased it in terms of what's valuable to the product manager, it's does this help them prioritize which areas to focus on? And so that's going to totally change my approach. I'm not going to focus on is that dimension table the best possible table. I'm going to focus on is this going to help the product manager prioritize? And what I show them at the end of the week, they're going to be able to say, yeah, that solves my business problem. Or maybe they'll say, no, it doesn't quite solve it, but why don't you try X, Y, and Z? So then we can have a really productive conversation at that point. The last one that I'm going to mention is T. That's testable. Testable means, can everybody agree when it's done? That's important because if you can't agree when it's done, then it probably means you didn't really understand what they were trying to do in the first place. And if you didn't understand what they're trying to do in the first place, then you're probably going to go off in the wrong direction, and then you're going to end up with wasted work. Now, at least you're only wasting it for a week instead of a month, but it's still wasted, and we don't want to do that. All right. Now, next I'm going to talk about iterating often. And there's a specific use case that I want to take you through where that was really important for us. So we have a lot of different ways that customers can get help. One of the ways that we've had is something called TurboTax Answer Exchange, which is a community where people can post questions and answer other people's questions. Now, this has been around for several years, but we decided late last year that we were going to make it much more central to how our users got help. We were going to put those community answers right inside the product. Now, we knew that when we did that, we would get a lot more customers posting questions. And we didn't want them to all sit around unanswered. So we decided that we were going to hire employees to help answer those questions. So the problem was, how could we manage an entirely new class of employees on an entirely new set of performance metrics? Because managing community answers is very different from managing answering phones. And by the way, we made this decision a couple weeks before we decided to start hiring those employees. So the old way we would have approached this is get all the requirements down in exhaustive detail, figure out what metrics are going to be important, plan out the architecture of how all the data will be collected and transformed, get everything scheduled, get the project management organization to help us get it on 5 different backlogs. But that would have worked maybe if we'd had 6 months or a year, but we had a couple of weeks. So we needed to move a lot faster. So we actually had to use a lot of the tools in our toolkit on this one. We had to iterate often. We had to have one person own it end to end. And we had to use user stories in Agile to get it done. So the first question that we had, which I'm going to phrase in terms of the user story, was, as an operations leader, I want to know how many questions our agents will answer so that I can make plans around hiring. Because if we don't know how many they can answer, we don't know how many to hire. What we delivered was pretty simple. Just a list of names and numbers. It looked really simple. There was actually a lot that went into it. So this actually took the full sprint most of the time, just working on this one table. The reason was that it forced us to make some critical decisions early on because we focused on getting to this end point. There was an open question around how are we going to integrate our agents with our community application? Our agent data was completely separate from our community data, and they didn't talk to each other. And that question could have sat out there for a while, not making any progress on it. But because we said by the end of this week, we're going to tell you how many answers are provided by our agents, we solved that problem very early on. Maybe not in the most elegant way, but we solved it. The second thing that we did was we figured out how to get the data up and hosted so that Tableau server could read it. That was another potential sticking point that we got out of the way very early by focusing on delivering value in that first sprint. So we figured out how to get all the databases, ACLs, I'm not sure what those are, maybe some of you guys know. We figured out how to get all those things done so that we could connect to the data. Then we sat down with our operations leader at the end of the sprint and said, does this answer your question? And actually, the answer was no. It didn't answer the question. Because it doesn't matter how many answers agents provided, it matters how fast they did it. Because if Bob works 2 more days than Sally does, and you see Bob has answered more questions than Sally, it's not actually helpful to know the number of questions. So we needed to know how fast our agents answered questions in order to really make plans around hiring. So we got to define a new metric, answers per working day. So in that next sprint, we came up with, we had the problem. We said, we think answers per working day will solve that problem. So we had to figure out, how do we know what a working day is? How do we know when an agent is scheduled to work and when they actually do show up for work that day so that we can make this a useful metric? That was another thing that could have been a sticky problem sitting around for a while not getting solved. But because it was one of our key focuses for the week, we figured it out. Now, you put a metric up there like answer rate. And certain people, our customer experience leader, is going to get really worried about that. Because he's going to say, well, if we're just managing agents according to rate, are they just going to be answering questions and not caring if it's the right answer or not? So that was our next user story. As an experience leader, he wanted to ensure that we were managing for good answers. Not just a drumbeat of churning answers out, but actually answering questions well so that our customers could be confident in filing their taxes. So we had to figure out, what does it mean to answer a question well? There were a lot of different ways that we measured self-help effectiveness, a lot of different ways that we measured resolution, and we came up with the feedback provided by the person who posted the question, or original poster, as we called it. Now, you'll notice these percentages are all over 100%. These numbers are all tweaked a little bit for this presentation because I couldn't put the real numbers up here. Now, we had that first way of defining if agents were answering questions well out there. But then we shared that with our team again and heard, well, as a self-help leader, I want to measure agents according to the feedback that their answers receive from regular viewers, not the person who posted the question, but just the people who are visiting the website. Because our self-help leader wanted to make sure that we were creating useful and reusable self-help content. That was the whole theory behind emphasizing community, is that you answer a question once and it solves 5 questions from 5 different customers. So then we got to create a new metric using the helpful rate from customers who didn't post the question. Now, we've been doing a pretty good job so far creating metrics, but what it's kind of turned into is just a wall of numbers. It's hard to make sense of this and say, well, where are we doing poorly, where are we doing well? Luckily, this is one of the things where Tableau really excels. So once we had all those metrics in there, our next user story was pretty easy. As any of these people, they wanted to be able to find outliers so that they could quickly zero in on the opportunities. So we just did a scatter plot. It was actually probably about 15 minutes worth of work, but we called it a week. So now with this, you could easily say, there's Bob down there in the lower left quadrant. It looks like Bob is really struggling. And we had all sorts of other ways to slice it too, but that was one of the key ones, was making sure that we were giving agents giving agents help when they needed it. Now, the coaches could see that Bob, if Bob was on their team, was down there in the lower left. But it was hard to do anything useful with that. Because you can't just go to Bob and say, hey, Bob, look at this chart. That's you. Don't be there. Go up here. That's not very helpful. That's not very practical. So our coaches needed a little bit more in order to actually do their jobs. They wanted to be able to see trends for Bob, to know, was Bob always having trouble, or is it just recently? They wanted to know details, so get more details on exactly how Bob was doing, because this here is just a couple of metrics. They wanted to find actual interactions. Since all of these interactions were public on our community, we wanted to find which interactions were going well, which weren't, so that the coach could step in and say, hey, Bob, I saw that the question you provided yesterday, it looked like you didn't really understand what the customer was asking. And so I would have answered it in a different way. Now, in order to do that, we provided a dashboard that had details for an individual employee that showed summary metrics, trends over time, and actually provided links to the individual interactions in the community so that the coach could find them and use them for coaching. And it was all tied to the original scatter plot. So you could click on Bob and bring up Bob's details over here. So at this point, we felt pretty good. We felt like we had an end-to-end analytics solution for everything we needed for managing agents. The only thing that was missing was, as we were growing and hiring more agents and hiring more coaches, we were having to have a lot of the same conversations around, well, here's what we mean by answer. Here's what we mean by resolve. Here's what we mean by this. And so we did something that you'll see a lot. We needed people to come up to speed quickly and understand how to use the dashboard and what the metrics meant. And we did that by providing a header. There were a couple things that we put in that header. One is we used the tooltip definitions that you see in a lot of workbooks now. So you would hover over a box, get a tooltip that defines what the metrics are, or get tooltips that tell you how to use the dashboard. Another thing that our team was having particular trouble with is, I didn't show it too much here, but we had a lot of different ways of filtering by dates. And it was easy for people to get lost and forget which dates they were looking at. So in that top left corner, we put, here's the dates that you're looking at right now, just so that we could make sure they didn't get lost. So those are the 4 key strategies. And so I'm going to kind of sum them up now. First, we made sure that our business users had an environment where they could play with the data. That was what got us out of the business of just answering questions and into the business of being partners. We needed to move really fast, and so we did that by embedding analysts in the teams, combining layers of work, adopting Agile, and iterating really often. And the last point that I'll focus on is something that was actually kind of hard for me. I'm a very analytical person, so I hate to put something out there unless I know it's perfect. But that's not actually a very productive mindset, because nothing is ever perfect, and good enough is usually good enough. So it's important to focus on delivery and iteration rather than perfection.
I'm curious in this last example you gave, we came back to him, does this meet your need? No, you iterate. How do you scope the engagement with the department or with the group, the time span of engagement? After the 3rd week, 4th week, you say, no, I got to cut because I got to go to finance.
Yeah, so we would usually have those conversations, not every week, but every couple of months we would say, all right, this is the area where Jonathan is focusing for the next foreseeable future. And we would say, Jonathan is going to be 80% focused on this team. He's going to be embedded with this team. And then whatever is the highest priority for them, he's going to work on. And so usually there would be some wrestling matches between the various teams to say, I think my team has got higher priority problems right now. And so those would usually happen on a less frequent basis at like the VP customer care staff meetings. They would say, well, here's what our big priorities are for the next couple months. So then they would reach out to the analytics team and say, we think we need somebody focused here, here, and here. Before I get into answering other questions, I want to give 2 plugs. One is that we are hiring. So this is maybe the 5th strategy for how you can scale up your Tableau implementation is just hire more people. So we've got a jobs website, and you can email me. My email address is up there. I'd be happy to give you a business card afterwards. My other plug is please provide feedback on this session. If you open up your app, open up the session, scroll down to the very bottom, and then there's a couple questions there. Fill that out and tap submit. If you're on an Android phone, you might have to dismiss your keyboard in order to see that submit button. This is my first time presenting at a conference like this, so I'd really like to hear what you think of it. And I know that Tableau people would also really like to hear because they've reminded us all to remind you. All right, so with that, any other questions?
Yeah, you were talking about the combining layers, and I was wondering if you had any problems with, you talked about the dev team creating kind of a self-service sort of dev package or kit. I was wondering if you had any problems with them maybe thinking they were working themselves out of a job, and how you deal with that fear question.
I can't get too deep into their heads, but I'll say that as they've shifted their focus, we've also increased investment in that area. So I don't see a lot of risk in that. It's kind of like the mouse and cookie model all over again. They gave us something that was more powerful, and in return, there was more value, so we continued to invest more there.
Can you talk a little bit more about your, so this was great in terms of looking at one, the end-to-end stories that work for one thing, but thinking in terms of like all the different projects you had going on, as well as extracting out those user stories from your users, when sometimes it's really difficult to get that from them. So
Yeah. Yeah, so when we started with user stories, this is different from how people usually think about asking for work. They were accustomed to saying, I want to see this data point sliced by X, Y, and Z. And so in order to get started, we really had to play 20 questions with them. So we had to say, well, what's good about seeing X data point? And what's good about that? And what's good about that? So playing the 5 whys game with them to figure out what were they really trying to do. And then over time, we would make sure to say, okay, so I think this is the user story. Is that what you're really trying to do? And then that sort of trained them to start to think in that framework. Go ahead. Go with you, then you.
So in meeting with these integrated teams every week, obviously you guys are probably publishing a lot of information out there from a dashboard perspective.
Yep.
Do you guys ever catch yourselves going back and cleaning it up? And if you do, what are some of the criteria that you are doing?
Well, we sure need to do that one of these days. So we do have a lot out there that isn't actively used. Right now, it's kind of been up to individual analysts to go in and say, yeah, I don't think this is relevant anymore. It's time to clean it up. And so after the end of tax season, when we had the April 15th deadline, a lot of us went in and cleaned up old stuff. But honestly, there's still a lot we still need to clean up. So we haven't quite figured out that yet. Go ahead.
So you talked about focusing on delivery and iteration rather than perfection. And you said you had a difficult time with it.
Yeah.
What was it that got you over that hurdle? Because that's a hurdle we're dealing with in our organization. And particularly from the IT guys, they want it to be absolutely perfect for anybody to see. Because it's their reputation on the line.
Yeah.
Even though we say to them, we've got to see it in order to know if it's right.
Yeah. I would
Get over that hurdle.
For me personally, it was after a couple of times of, so when I first started sharing things out, I wouldn't publish it to server for all to see. I would sit down with the person who had requested the work and go over the Tableau workbook with them. And then after a couple of times of doing that, I got to see that I was getting really good, useful feedback by showing it to them at an earlier stage in the process. And so it was just, for me, it was a couple times of experiencing the value of it. And yeah. So what helped me get over it was just doing it on a smaller scale, person to person, instead of out to the whole world. Go ahead.
What piece of pieces of Scrum did you throw out the window?
Estimation, that was one of the big ones, because when we spent 30 minutes in planning, that wasn't enough time to come up with sizes of stories. The distinction between epics and user stories, we threw that out. So pretty much everything that we used in Scrum was what you saw up here. Go ahead.
Your testing, did you really automate that in a way, or did you just kind of set up goals and just kind of went along each week?
So a lot of it was kind of making it up as we go, to be honest. In that 30-minute review session, we would use the time where we were looking back on what didn't work, why didn't we finish this, to kind of pick out which areas of the process did we want to iterate on. Does that help answer your question?
Yeah, because we get a lot of push to really do the automated testing, which I can see value for, but it takes a lot of setup.
Oh, yeah, automated testing. I actually love automated testing. We're starting to do a little bit more of that, and I'm just seeing tremendous value out of it, because one person is just hard-pressed to test all aspects of an implementation. Now, it does take a long time to come up with those use cases, to your point. So what's really helped us there is we've been starting to work with the QA teams on the actual development teams that we work with. So I work with a support site team that has engineers and QAs, and by bringing those QAs into the process, they're happy to read through those requirements and come up with test cases. They love that stuff. Go ahead.
How do you, or do you see that you get a lot of redundant work because the analysts are embedded in the teams? How do you deal with that? That's one part of the question.
Yeah.
The second part is, how do you do really complicated data integration projects?
Yeah, so as far as redundant work, we don't have too much of that, because we would have meetings across the team in that area to talk about what were we working on, what issues were coming up. So this was actually one element of Scrum that I didn't talk about was daily stand-ups. So we would get together and talk as a team, and so we were able to catch those redundancies early on.
Between the analysts.
That's right. And what was your second?
How do you deal with really complex data integration problems? Let's say that it's a new system that you don't have and you need to bring in to be accessed by several managers.
Yeah, so I would say the hardest part of data integration was just getting the right systems to talk to each other, because we would find some team was working with a database that was often one data center that didn't have all the connections to Tableau that we needed and things like that. And so the way that we solved it was kind of piecemeal. The most important stuff, we would figure out a way to get the data in, and that was where I had to bring in people who worked on the database teams, and so that was where things slowed down a lot. And so a lot of times when a story wasn't finished in a week, it was often because it takes more than a week to get those things done sometimes, because they have to go through an approval process and things like that. It still is a challenge for us, to be honest, but I think it's getting better, because we are, like I said, focusing on scalable scaffolding that helps us get that data in. And so one of the things is just standardized data ingestion formats. Help those things not be piecemeal. You have a standard set of questions that you answer, and then the team is able to execute on it really quickly. I still don't love it, because it's still in that space of they need to understand the problem and then just press one button, which I don't like that very much, but that's kind of where we are today.
Do you do your data blending outside of Tableau, or do you do it within Tableau? Like, that's one of the things
yeah.
I heard a lot of in the presentations. I mean, that was one of the big sell points for us with Tableau, was you can do all this data blending. We've not been hugely successful with it, and we have most of our data blending outside.
Yeah,
Doing it in as a blended piece of data.
I would say we have two separate use cases. One is we have what we call the run the business dashboards, which are reporting on the same metrics week after week. And so there we really value consistency. And so what we've done for those is we've built Tableau data sources, and then when we need to use multiple of those Tableau data sources, we blend those data sources with each other. For a lot of the project work, we don't have a great desire for consistency across teams because it's only one team using it. And so within that team, they'll generally do any data blending on the database side through SQL queries.
What's your user adoption curve look like, and do you use more of a push versus a pull to get people to use Tableau dashboards in customers?
Yeah, so we started using Tableau not quite 2 years ago on a pilot basis, just to kind of prove out the value of it. And then we really sort of started to scale up last year. And now, essentially, everybody in TurboTax is on Tableau's server and using it regularly. What we do is when people join teams, they do have to request access. And so we make sure that they're going through the analyst to make sure they know when they have questions about the data they're looking at, they have that analyst who got them access to available to help answer their questions. So it's kind of I guess it's kind of a pull model. People have to ask for access, but hundreds of them have.
Was it rapid or was it slow and then exponential?
Slow and then exponential. For the first year where we were proving out the value, there wasn't a lot in there, so not very many people wanted to use it. But at the start of this tax season, we went from very small number of users, dozens, up to hundreds in a matter of weeks or months. Go ahead.
So in terms of like your post-launch life cycle, can you tell us a little bit, like after you've launched maybe one of these run business dashboards, like when you go back and like do another iteration, or like what's the process?
Yeah, I guess it's pretty much as often as people need changes. So we didn't have a very well-defined process. We just said, we'll work on the most important stuff to you. And so if they said that was important, then we would iterate. If they said it was good enough, then we would kind of keep it going.
Do you have like a ticketing system instead of backlog or something like that?
We use Jira to store the user stories. So go ahead.
What is the total development time for you to come up with the core strategies compared between you and your shareholders? You're asking a few questions and you see refine this stage from 1 to 6, and is it a month or quarter?
Yeah, so generally when new requests come in, we try to execute them on them almost immediately. So we don't look out very far into the future on most of the project work. We're thinking, how can we get this done in the next week or in the next 2 weeks?
What's your team size?
So Chris and Linda down here are my partners on customer care, and we have 2 other partners on customer care. As far as across all of TurboTax, I'm not really sure. It keeps changing. Hopefully more than yesterday. Go ahead.
Nice presentation. You talked about the daily scrum with the other analysts in the group. What's the daily interaction you have then with the business partners?
Yeah, so I would try to sit actually with my business partner team a couple days a week. And so that would look like, attending their staff meetings, sitting out at common tables where, you would be sitting and working, but if people had questions or wanted to chat, they could come up and chat.
A little more ad hoc.
Yeah, fairly ad hoc. Go ahead.
2 questions. So you said about how you moved into different skill sets within the week. So you suggest that vendors to actually just keep it at that model, that you just keep the work ranks on that. You've got to wait another week for them 3 years to do something if someone's run over. You just still keep on that way and not the agile process of anyone.
Yeah, so if I understand correctly, the question is kind of, if you're focusing on such a very short timeline, sometimes it's really hard to get to a valuable deliverable in 1 week because the scope of the problem is so big. Is that kind of what the question is?
Yes, so we kind of follow an agile model at the moment in terms of anyone, regardless of whether they're expert or novice, like SQL writing, pick up. But I'm kind of getting the information from what you're saying is that actually you keep people on the specific areas their expertise are.
Right, that's exactly right. So Over a time period of a couple months, generally a single analyst will be dedicated to a particular project area that's, topically centered around one thing. And so they build up a certain level of rapport with the team and experience with the topic. And then when things come up for that sprint, it's pretty much that person for that team is the one who gets it done. We're not super interchangeable right now. Yeah. Yeah, that's right.
Could you explain a little bit more about your team dynamics? So you have an embedded analyst for a certain part of the business. So when they need a certain data set, do you have an engineer that creates the data source as well? Or do you pass that on?
So usually where engineers get involved is on the database connection side. So anything where we need to set up network access or things like that in order to get the data from one place to another. Any work around creating a Tableau data source would be done by that embedded person. So that person is pretty much working end to end, except for partnering with the product manager or business person on strategy, and then the actual application team. And so for me, an application team would look like the web developers on our support site, because they would need to make any changes to the application to collect more data. Yeah.
Your question about if deliverables do need to take longer than a week or a project will take, what do you do in those?
So when something is so big that it really does take longer than a week, which does come up, usually we fake it. We either say, all right, this really is too big, and so we'll go against our principles and create a user story that doesn't have a valuable deliverable. Or sometimes we'll just work on it and not talk about it. We'll just say, you know what, we don't have as much bandwidth this week because we're working on something that we're not going to tell you about. You have to have a certain level of trust to do that, though. All right. Well, it's just about time, so I'll hang out here if you want to talk to me at the podium afterwards. But otherwise, thank you very much for coming. Appreciate it.